What's up, everybody? Welcome to The Constitutional Architect. Did you know there's an active movement to repeal the 17th Amendment? To take away your right to vote for a U.S. senator and return the power to the state legislatures?
I don't know how I feel about it. Feel about what?
Justice Scalia supported it. Senator Mike Lee supported it. Utah's legislature passed a resolution calling for it. Their argument goes back to the Constitutional Convention itself. And it's not that crazy.
But I'm not crazy, she's crazy. I'm not crazy, she's crazy.
This episode is about the constitutional design choice the founders made deliberately, a problem that developed over 125 years, an argument that was supposed to fix it, and a debate that has never resolved whether the cure was worse than the disease. Real quick, let me introduce myself. I'm JP, a former Special Forces operator with 14 years of service, having deployed to 11 countries across 3 continents. In that line of work, you learn something about institutional design, about why structures are built the way they are, and what happens when you change them. Sometimes the original design had a logic people stop understanding after they've lived with the revision long enough to forget what it was solving. The 17th Amendment is one of those cases. This channel gives you the tools to think through these provisions for yourself. Let's get into it.
You ready?
Alright, let's talk about the original design. The Constitution, as written in 1787, gave voters one direct vote in the federal government, the House of Representatives. The Senate was different. Article 1, Section 3 read, "Senators shall be chosen by the legislature of each state. 2 per state, 6-year terms, not elected by the people, chosen by the people's representatives at the state level." That was deliberate. The founders were building a bicameral legislature with 2 genuinely different constituencies. The House represented the people, distributed by population, elected every 2 years, directly accountable to voters. The Senate was designed to represent states as political entities, equally regardless of size, and accountable to state legislatures rather than the voting public. James Madison argued in Federalist number 62 that the arrangement gave state governments such an agency in the formation of the federal government as must secure the authority of the former.
Can you explain that, Leopold?
In plain terms, states would have a formal voice in federal lawmaking. A senator who ignored the interests of its state legislature could be replaced by that legislature. The states had leverage. Alexander Hamilton put it this way at the New York Ratifying Convention: "Senators will constantly look up to the state governments with an eye on dependence." They'd have to. Their political survival depended on it. The logic of the original design was this: give the people the House, give the states the Senate, and require both to agree before any law gets made. That structure was supposed to make it harder for the federal government to overpower the states. The states had a check, a formal structural check, built into the legislature itself. For the first century of the Republic, that's how it worked. As always, there's a problem.
It didn't go as planned.
By the mid to late 1800s, the system was breaking down. 2 specific failures drove the push for reform. Deadlock. Senators were chosen by state legislatures, but what happened when the legislature itself couldn't agree? When different parties controlled different chambers, or when no candidate could secure a majority, the seat simply stayed vacant. Indiana had a Senate vacancy for 2 years in the 1850s. Delaware went without full state representation for 4 years between 1899 and 1903. In the worst cases, legislatures were so consumed by the fight over a Senate seat that they neglected the actual work of governing the state. Next, corruption. Buying a U.S. Senate seat didn't require running a campaign. You had to secure enough votes in the state legislature. That was a much smaller, more manageable number of people. And in the Gilded Age, wealthy industrialists and corporate interests were very good at managing it.
Oh, why don't you just pay them off?
Senate seats were openly purchased. William Clark of Montana was so brazen about bribing legislatures that the Senate refused to seat him on his first election. He tried again, won again, and was eventually seated. The Senate became known as the Millionaires Club, not because the best people rose to it, but because the richest people could buy their way into it. By 1893, proposals for direct Senate elections were passing the House, but the Senate itself blocked them for 20 years. The senators who would have to vote for the change were the ones who were benefiting from the existing system. The workaround came from the states. Oregon developed what became known as the Oregon system, a state primary election where voters expressed their preference for senator, with candidates for the state legislature pledging to honor the result. It was legally non-binding, but politically powerful. By 1912, over half the states had adopted some version of it. Direct election was already happening. The amendment formalized what had already emerged from the ground up. By 1910, 31 state legislatures had passed resolutions calling on Congress to pass a direct election amendment. The Senate finally relented. The amendment passed both chambers in 1912 and was ratified on April 8, 1913.
Finally.
Alright, the words themselves. The 17th Amendment replaced the original Article 1, Section 3 language, chosen by the legislature thereof, with 5 words, elected by the people thereof. It has 2 sections. Section 1 establishes direct election of senators by the voters of each state, using the same voter qualifications as the most numerous branch of the state legislature. Section 2 addresses vacancies. When a Senate seat opens up, the governor of the state issues a writ of election. The state legislature may authorize the governor to make a temporary appointment until the special election is held. That's it. Clean, direct, one structural change. The Senate goes from being accountable to state legislatures to being accountable to voters. All right, the debate that hasn't ended. Here's where the episode becomes a live constitutional debate rather than settled history. The repeal movement argues the 17th Amendment destroyed something essential in the Constitution's architecture. The original Senate was the state's check on the federal government. Senators who were accountable to the state legislature would protect state interests. They'd resist unfunded federal mandates, resist federal overreach in areas the states considered their own, resist the accumulation of power in Washington. The moment senators became accountable to voters rather than state legislatures, that check disappeared. Senators now had every incentive to deliver federal programs and federal spending to their constituents, and no institutional reason to worry about what it cost the states to administer. Justice Scalia said it directly. The 17th Amendment had changed things enormously. He argued the framers understood the Senate has a structural protection for state sovereignty, and that protection was gone the moment senators stopped answering to state governments. Senator Mike Lee of Utah has been the most prominent active advocate for repeal. His argument? The Senate was designed to represent states as states. Without that design, the states have no formal voice in federal lawmaking, and federal powers over states has grown accordingly. Unfunded mandates, federal regulatory overreach, he traces a lot of it back to 1913. Utah's legislature passed a resolution in 2016 formally calling on Congress to repeal the amendment.
What if we disagree, Doc?
The argument against repeal is equally serious. Direct election made senators accountable to the people, which is the foundation of democratic government. State legislatures were demonstrably corrupt in their selection of senators. Deadlocks left states without representation for years. The original system produced William Clark buying his Senate seat. That was the problem the amendment solved. Critics of repeal also point out the returning senators' selection to state legislatures would not produce senators who represent the states. It would produce senators who represent whatever party controls the state legislature at that moment of selection. That's not the same thing. There's a deeper point that constitutional scholars have raised. By 1913, state legislatures themselves were actively trying to give away the power to choose senators. 31 state legislatures had called for the amendment. The states weren't being stripped of the power they wanted to keep. They were voluntarily surrendering it because the system was producing corruption and deadlock rather than quality representation.
I do not want that power.
Whether that was a mistake those legislatures came to regret is genuinely contested. All right, where it stands today. The 17th Amendment is not going to be repealed anytime soon. Repealing it would require 2/3 of the Senate to vote to eliminate their own direct electoral mandate, senators voting to make themselves answerable to state legislatures instead of voters. The political incentives run entirely the other way. But the underlying constitutional question is worth sitting with. Is the Senate a second house of the people, a more deliberative, long-tenured version of the House, where the equal representation of states is simply a structural feature? Or was it supposed to be something fundamentally different? An institution where the states, as political entities, have a direct voice in the federal government? That question was answered one way in 1787. It was answered a different way in 1913. And the people who think the 1913 answer was wrong have not stopped making their case. And that's the 17th Amendment. We did it! A structural change to the Senate that came out of real corruption and real deadlock, and that remains genuinely controversial among serious constitutional thinkers more than a century later. Next episode, I'm going to do the 18th and the 21st together, because that's the only way to tell this story properly. The 18th Amendment banned alcohol in 1919. The 21st repealed it in 1933. They are the only pair of amendments in American history where one was written specifically to undo the other. Prohibition produced organized crime, speakeasies, a federal enforcement apparatus that couldn't contain what it had created, and 14 years of evidence that you cannot use the Constitution to solve a problem the Constitution was never built to solve. The 21st is the admission that the 18th was a mistake. If this episode gave you something to think about, like, share, follow, and please go subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you then.
This road is crawling with cops, Cricket. You know, we're just hitting duck. Oh, you gotta be kidding. Come on, you got a better idea. You gonna put moonshine in the gas tank? Come on.